At 5:42 on the morning of December 18th, 1944, Sergeant Thomas Red Miller sat huddled in the open turret of his M18 Hellcat, his breath turning to white smoke in the freezing air of the Ardennes forest. 800 yards to the east, cutting through the dense winter fog, the sound of tank tracks crushing frozen earth began to echo. It wasn't the rattle of a Panzer IV. It was the deep, guttural growl of a 700-horsepower Maybach engine, a Tiger. The infantry of the 99th Division called Miller's vehicle the Cracker Box. Logistics officers called it the Armored Race Car. But the most painful nickname came from the Sherman crews. They called it a toy. When Miller received this M18 6 months ago, he was told it was the pinnacle of tank destroyer doctrine. But here in Europe, the technical specs felt like a cruel joke. This toy weighed only 18 tons. Its front armor was less than an inch thick, so thin a heavy machine gun could punch through at close range. Worse, it had no roof. An open turret meant that if an enemy shell didn't kill you, shrapnel from airbursts or a sniper in a tree could wipe out the entire crew. Compare that to the monster approaching through the fog. The Tiger I, 60 tons of steel, 4 inches of frontal armor, impervious to standard fire. Its legendary 88mm gun could turn Miller's M18 into a burning scrap heap from 2,000 yards away, far beyond Miller's effective range. In the eyes of the generals, this was a fight between a bicycle and an armored truck. Miller had heard officers whisper that sending an M18 head-on against a Tiger was a suicide mission. But Miller knew what the mockers didn't. This toy had the heart of a beast, a Continental radial engine that pushed it to 50 miles per hour, the fastest tracked vehicle of the war. And it carried the 76mm high-velocity gun. It wasn't an 88, but Miller had hoarded 6 rounds of precious HVAP armor-piercing ammunition. With those, he could punch through a Tiger's flank, but only if he got close. Terrifyingly close. Under 600 yards. The situation in Rocherath was desperate. The Battle of the Bulge was in its 3rd day. The 1st SS Panzer Division was piercing the American lines. Intelligence reported a platoon of Tigers leading the spearhead. Miller's unit was the last stop before the command post. No air support in this blizzard, no heavy artillery, just Miller and his crew. He ordered his driver, Corporal Jackson, to kill the engine. He needed to listen. The ground beneath their tracks began to tremble. Miller hadn't chosen a standard ambush spot at the crossroads. He knew experienced Tiger commanders would shell the intersection first. Instead, he had done something insane. He had backed his toy into a muddy drainage ditch behind a ruined barn. It was a death trap with no exit, but it gave him a view of the slope the Tigers had to climb. Miller did the math. As the Tiger crested the rise, it would expose its vulnerable belly or flank for exactly 4 seconds before its gun could depress to find him. 4 seconds to spot, traverse, aim, and fire. With paper-thin armor, there would be no second chance. "HVAP up," Miller whispered over the intercom. Private Kowalski hugged the cold steel of the shell. Sergeant Davis pressed his eye to the optic, wiping away the condensation. At 6:05 a.m., the first shape emerged from the fog. A blocky, massive silhouette with a long 88mm barrel pointing forward like the finger of death. A Tiger I. But it wasn't alone. Behind the growl of the first engine came a second, then a third. Miller swallowed hard. He wasn't hunting a stray. He was standing in the path of a wolf pack, and all he had was a toy. The lead Tiger was now 400 yards away. It filled the optic sight, a gray wall of death moving at a terrifyingly slow pace. Miller could see the infantrymen walking behind it, using the tank's massive bulk as a shield against small arms fire. They looked relaxed, confident in the invincibility of their steel god. They had no idea that a toy was watching them from the mud, 70 yards to their left. Miller's hand hovered near the intercom switch. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his voice was ice cold. "Wait for it," he whispered. "Let him expose the sponson. Aim for the ammo rack." Sergeant Davis made a micro-adjustment on the traverse wheel. The M18's turret whined softly, almost inaudible over the roar of the German engines. 300 yards. The lead Tiger began to pivot, turning slightly to navigate the icy incline leading into the village. As it turned, the thick frontal armor angled away, revealing the flat, vertical plate of the hull side above the tracks. It was a target window no bigger than a suitcase. But for a crew that had trained until their hands bled, it was enough. "Fire!" Miller screamed. The 76mm gun roared. The muzzle brake deflected the blast sideways, kicking up a massive cloud of snow and mud that instantly blinded them. The lightweight chassis of the Hellcat rocked violently backward, shuddering like a kicked dog. For a split second, there was only the ringing in their ears and the smell of cordite. "Hit! Target hit!" Kowalski yelled, already shoving a second shell into the breach. Through the clearing smoke, Miller saw the result. A small, black hole had appeared on the side of the Tiger, right below the turret ring. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The massive tank simply stopped. Then, a jet of white-hot flame erupted from the commander's cupola like a blowtorch. The HVAP round had punched through the armor and ignited the ammunition stored in the sponsons. The explosion that followed tore the heavy turret clean off the hull, flipping it into the air like a coin. 60 tons of German engineering had just been decapitated by an 18-ton American toy. But there was no time to celebrate. The element of surprise was gone. The two remaining Tigers in the column reacted with terrifying speed. Their turrets began to traverse toward the plume of smoke rising from Miller's ditch. "Driver, reverse, get us out of here. Go, go, go," Miller roared into the mic. This was the moment of truth. This was where the toy had to prove its worth. A Sherman tank would have been too slow to clear the mud. A Pershing would have bogged down. But the M18 was built for speed. Jackson slammed the transmission into reverse and floored the accelerator. The Continental engine screamed, pushing 400 horsepower into the tracks. The Hellcat leaped backward out of the ditch just as an 88mm high-explosive shell slammed into their previous position. The ground erupted. Shrapnel pinged off the thin hull like hail on a tin roof. If they had been there 1 second longer, they would be dead. Miller grabbed the turret ring to steady himself as the tank fishtailed violently on the ice. They weren't retreating, they were relocating. This was the core of tank destroyer doctrine: shoot and scoot, strike from the shadows, disappear, and strike again from a new angle. "Hard right! Behind the church," Miller commanded. He had memorized the layout of Rochereth. He knew the alleyways were too narrow for the Tigers, but perfect for the slender M18. As they tore through the ruined streets, crashing through fences and debris, Miller was already formulating the next phase of the ambush. The remaining Tigers would be furious. They would push forward aggressively to crush the insect that had stung them. They would expect the enemy to be in front of them. Miller intended to be behind them. He directed Jackson to loop around the burning ruins of the town square, aiming to flank the convoy from the west. The Hellcat drifted around corners like a rally car, its tracks throwing up rooster tails of frozen mud. They reached a new firing position behind a stone wall near the cemetery. Miller peered through his binoculars. The second Tiger had advanced past the burning wreck of its leader. It was hunting, its barrel sweeping left and right, searching for a heavy tank. It never occurred to the German commander that the thing that killed his comrade was fast enough to already be on his flank. "Target number 2, Miller said, his voice trembling slightly with adrenaline. "Range 250. Flank shot. Give me another HVAP." Kowalski loaded the round. The metallic clang of the breech block closing sounded like the tolling of a bell. The second Tiger was closer now, so close Miller could see the condensation on the German commander's goggles as he scanned the tree line. The predator had become the prey, and it didn't even know it. "Fire!" Miller screamed, his voice cracking over the roar of the battle. The 76mm gun bucked violently. At 250 yards, the flight time of the high-velocity projectile was virtually instantaneous. The round slammed into the side of the second Tiger, just above the road wheels. There was no explosion this time, just a sickening metallic crunch that sounded like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. The German tank shuddered to a halt, its tracks still churning up the frozen earth as the transmission locked. Inside the Tiger, the physics of kinetic energy turned the interior into a hellscape. The shell had pierced the fuel tank. A heartbeat later, the beast vomited a geyser of black diesel smoke mixed with orange flame. The hatch flew open, and a lone tanker scrambled out, his uniform smoking, diving into the snow. 2 down. Driver, forward. Hard left. Get into the tree line. Miller commanded. He didn't wait to confirm the kill. He knew the remaining Tigers would now be in a frenzy. The element of surprise had mutated into chaos. The Germans no longer believed they were facing a single toy. The speed and violence of the attacks convinced them they had walked into a trap set by an entire tank destroyer battalion. Jackson gunned the engine, and the Hellcat surged forward, tearing through a wooden fence and plunging into the dense pine forest bordering the cemetery. Branches whipped against the open turret, stinging Miller's face, but he didn't flinch. He was busy scanning the map in his mind. The remaining 3 Tigers would do one of 2 things. They would either retreat to regroup, or they would form a defensive circle and level everything in sight. As they settled into a hull-down position behind a ridge of frozen earth, the sound of the battle changed. The deep, rhythmic thumping of the 88mm guns began. They weren't firing at specific targets. They were firing at ghosts. High-explosive shells began to walk across the village, pulverizing the stone cottages where Miller had been just minutes ago. The German commanders were panic-firing, trying to flush out the invisible enemy. "Loader, check ammo," Miller hissed. 4 HVAP left, Sarge. 18 HE, Kowalski reported, his hands trembling as he cleared the spent brass from the floor of the turret. 4 armor-piercing rounds. 3 Tigers left. The math was unforgiving. 1 miss, 1 ricochet, and the game was over. Miller peeked over the rim of the turret. The fog was beginning to lift, burned away by the rising sun and the heat of the burning tanks. This was bad. The M18's greatest armor was invisibility. Without the fog, they were just an open-topped bucket of bolts sitting in a shooting gallery. Then he saw it. The 3rd Tiger. It had separated from the others, moving slowly down the main road toward the church, its turret traversing frantically from left to right. This commander was smart. He wasn't panic-firing. He was hunting. He knew the shots had come from the flanks, so he had positioned his tank with its rear against a stone wall, protecting his vulnerable exhaust port. He was forcing a head-on engagement. A head-on fight was exactly what Miller couldn't win. The Tiger's front armor was 100mm thick. Miller's 76mm shell would bounce off that plate like a pebble off a windshield, even at point-blank range. "We can't take him from here, Sarge," Davis whispered, his eye glued to the scope. "He's angling his armor. If we shoot, we just ring his bell, and he kills us." Miller looked around. The terrain was flat, open fields covered in snow. No cover to flank. No ditches deep enough to hide the hull. If they wanted to kill Tiger number 3, they had to make him move. They had to bait the trap. "Jackson," Miller said, a crazy idea forming in the back of his mind. "I want you to rev the engine, make it scream, then cut it immediately." "Sarge, do it. We need him to look at us." Jackson stomped on the accelerator in neutral. The Continental radial engine roared like a banshee, the sound echoing off the trees. It was a challenge, a scream of defiance. In the distance, the turret of the 3rd Tiger snapped toward the tree line. The bait was taken. The German commander saw the puff of exhaust smoke rising from the pines. Slowly, methodically, the massive tank began to turn its hull toward Miller's position, its long 88mm barrel lowering to align with the ridge. "He's targeting us, Sarge," Davis yelled. "Wait." Miller held up a hand. "Wait for him to commit." The Tiger began to roll forward, crushing the debris in the road, closing the distance. It was leaving the protection of the stone wall. It was coming to crush the insolent American toy. But in his eagerness to kill, the German commander made a fatal error. He was moving across uneven ground. As the Tiger crested a small mound of rubble in the road, its nose pointed skyward for a fraction of a second. And in that fraction of a second, the lower glacis plate, the angled armor, protecting the bottom of the hull, flattened out relative to Miller's gun. The angle of deflection disappeared. It was a shot 1 in 100 gunners would even see, let alone take. Lower hull. Now, Davis fired. The M18 kicked back so hard, Miller's helmet slammed against the ring sight. The shell streaked across the open field, a blur of tungsten and steel. It didn't bounce. It caught the Tiger exactly as it crested the rubble, punching through the lower plate and into the transmission housing. The Tiger stopped dead, lurching forward violently as its momentum fought against the shattered gears. Smoke didn't come out the back this time. It poured out the driver's viewport. They had gutted the beast. 3, Miller breathed. But the celebration died in his throat as a shell whistled overhead, the shockwave nearly knocking him unconscious. The fourth Tiger had found them. The shell from the fourth Tiger detonated 20 feet behind them, uprooting a massive pine tree that crashed down across the Hellcat's rear deck. Branches and snow buried the open turret, blinding the crew for a terrifying second. But the M18 was still moving. Jackson had slammed the transmission into gear before the tree even hit the ground, and the toy tank clawed its way forward, dragging the debris with it like a wounded animal shedding a trap. "Clear the deck! Get that wood off us!" Miller screamed, kicking at the heavy pine boughs while simultaneously scanning the tree line. They were alive, but they had lost the initiative. The fourth Tiger wasn't playing games. It was spraying the forest with coaxial machine gun fire, chewing through the soft timber as if it were paper. Bullets sparked off the Hellcat's thin armor shield, sending lethal fragments buzzing around the crew's heads. This was the nightmare of the open-top tank destroyer. You didn't need a direct hit from an 88mm to die. A stray burst of machine gun fire could wipe out the entire crew in seconds. Miller dropped low, eyes glued to the periscope. "He's bracketing us, Jackson. Hard right. Get behind the elevation." The M18 surged over a frozen drainage ditch, its suspension bottoming out with a bone-jarring slam. They disappeared behind a small hillock, just as another high-explosive shell vaporized the ground where they had been 5 seconds ago. The shockwave rattled Miller's teeth, but they were momentarily safe. "Status," Miller barked. "Engine temp is climbing, Sarge," Jackson yelled back. "We're pushing her too hard." "Push her harder. If we stop, we die." Miller checked his mental map. 3 Tigers were dead. 2 remained. The fourth one, the one hunting them now, was positioned near the crossroads, guarding the main approach. The fifth one was still unaccounted for, likely hanging back as a reserve. The Germans were no longer advancing in a column. They had spread out, turning the village of Rosherath into a kill zone. Miller knew he couldn't go back the way he came. The fourth Tiger had that sector dialed in. He had to do the unthinkable. He had to go through the village center. The streets were narrow, choked with rubble and burning half-tracks. It was suicide for a tank. But for the nimble M18, it was a racetrack. "We're going urban," Miller told the crew. "Close quarters. Keep your heads down. Davis, traverse front. Be ready for anything." The Hellcat burst from the cover of the woods and roared onto the cobblestone main street. It was a scene from hell. Buildings were burning on both sides, casting flickering shadows that looked like enemy tanks. The noise was deafening, the roar of the fire mixing with the scream of their own engine. Miller guided Jackson through the smoke, weaving around shell craters and fallen telephone poles. They were flanking the fourth Tiger from the inside out. "Left at the bakery." "Now," Miller commanded. Jackson yanked the steering lever. The Hellcat drifted sideways, its tracks sparking against the stone, and slid into a narrow alleyway. They were now less than 100 yards from where Miller estimated the fourth Tiger to be. He signaled Jackson to creep forward. The engine rumbled at idle, a low growl compared to its earlier scream. They reached the corner. Miller peeked around the edge of the building. There it was, the fourth Tiger. It was sitting stationary in the middle of the intersection, its hull angled toward the forest where Miller had been minutes ago. The German commander was focused on the tree line, waiting for the Americans to re-emerge. He had no idea the Americans were now 50 yards to his right, staring at his flank. But there was a problem. The Tiger was positioned next to a burning fuel truck. The smoke was thick, obscuring the precise aim point for the ammunition rack. If Miller missed the sweet spot, the shell might pass harmlessly through the engine compartment or bounce off the road wheels. "I can't see the ammo rack, Sarge," Davis whispered, sweat dripping into his eyes despite the freezing cold. "Too much smoke." "Forget the ammo rack," Miller said, his voice deadly calm. "Break his leg." "Say again?" "The drive sprocket. The front wheel. Put a shell right into the gears. Immobilize him." It was a surgeon's shot. The drive sprocket was a small, toothed wheel at the front of the tracks. Hitting it would shatter the drivetrain, turning the 60-ton monster into a 60-ton pillbox. It wouldn't kill the crew, but it would strip them of their mobility. And a Tiger that couldn't move was a Tiger that couldn't turn its thick front armor to face the threat. On the way, Davis breathed. The 76mm gun fired. The distance was so short the sound was a physical blow. The armor-piercing round slammed into the front drive sprocket of the Tiger with a shower of sparks. The massive steel track snapped instantly, unspooling onto the cobblestones like a dead snake. The Tiger lurched violently to the right as the remaining track kept pushing, spinning the tank halfway around before the engine stalled. "Hit! He's tracked!" Kowalski yelled. The German turret began to swing toward them, but the sudden spin had disoriented the gunner. The long 88mm barrel swept past the alleyway, missing them. "Finish him!" Miller roared. "Side hull! Now!" Davis didn't need to be told twice. The Tiger's spin had exposed its broad, flat side armor perfectly perpendicular to the alley. He slammed a second round into the flank. This time, there was no delay. The shell found the fuel stores. The Tiger erupted instantly, the ammunition cooking off in a series of catastrophic explosions that blew the hatches open. A pillar of fire shot 50 feet into the air. 4 down, 1 to go. But as the echo of the explosion faded, a new sound emerged, a low, grinding mechanical noise coming from behind them, from the very alley they had just used. Miller turned around, his blood running cold. The 5th Tiger hadn't been in reserve. It had been trailing them. It was blocking their exit. They were trapped in a burning street, with a 60-ton executioner closing in from behind. "Traverse the rear! Traverse the rear!" Miller screamed, his voice shredding his throat. The electric motor of the turret whined in protest as Davis spun the hand crank to assist. But it was too slow. The Tiger filled the alleyway like a cork in a bottle. Its muzzle brake was black with soot, and it was lowering directly at them. They were staring down the throat of the Dragon. "We can't get the gun around in time," Davis yelled. "Driver, hard left, through the wall." Miller didn't hesitate. He pointed at the burning storefront of a bakery directly to their left. It was a desperate gamble. The timber-framed building was old, its structure weakened by fire. If the floor held, they might make it. If the basement collapsed, they would be buried in a burning tomb. Jackson didn't question the order. He slammed the left steering lever back and floored the gas. The Hellcat pivoted on its tracks, its rear end swinging violently. With a sickening crunch of shattering wood and masonry, the 18-ton tank smashed through the front window of the bakery. Bricks rained down into the open turret. A burning beam glanced off the ring mount, singeing Miller's jacket. Dust and flour filled the air, coating them in a ghostly white powder. But the tracks kept gripping. The Continental engine roared, pushing them through the shop, over the counter, and out through the back wall into a small courtyard. Behind them, the alley exploded. The Tiger's 88mm shell had fired a split second too late, demolishing the spot where the Hellcat had been. The blast wave followed them through the hole in the wall, hot and sharp. "We're alive! We're alive!" Kowalski was laughing hysterically, wiping flour and blood from his face. "Cut the chatter!" Miller snapped, though his own hands were shaking uncontrollably. He missed. Now he's reloading. That takes 8 seconds. "Jackson, get us to the parallel street. We're going to come out behind him." The courtyard led to a narrow lane running parallel to the main alley. The Hellcat tore down the cobblestones, its suspension working overtime as it bounced over debris. Miller was counting down in his head. 5 seconds. 6 seconds. Right turn. Now. They drifted around the corner, back onto the main street. And there it was, the 5th Tiger. It was still sitting in the alley mouth, its turret facing the bakery, smoke pouring from its gun barrel. The German commander was convinced he had destroyed them. He was likely radioing his victory to headquarters. He never saw the toy drift into position behind him. Target rear. Range, 70 yards. Make it count, Davis. Last HVAP. Identified, Davis said. His voice was steady again. The drill took over. The crosshairs settled on the exhaust pipes of the Tiger. The heat shimmering from the German engine distorted the view slightly, but at this range, it didn't matter. Fire. The final armor-piercing round left the barrel. It struck the Tiger square in the rear engine plate. There was no deflection. The shell punched through the thin rear armor, smashed into the engine block, and continued into the crew compartment. The beast died instantly. No fire, no explosion. Just a sudden, violent cessation of life. The engine cut out. The turret stopped moving. Smoke began to lazily drift from the hatches. Miller slumped back against the turret ring. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise of battle. 5 Tigers. 1 hour. 1 toy. Clear, Miller whispered into the intercom. All stations, clear. Snow began to fall again, covering the burning wrecks and the blackened streets of Rocherath. They had held the line. They had proven that it wasn't the thickness of the armor that mattered, but the heart of the crew inside. For 2 minutes, nobody moved. The only sound in the narrow street was the ticking of cooling metal and the hiss of steam escaping from the Tiger's shattered radiator. Inside the Hellcat, the air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt cordite and the copper tang of fierce sweat. Miller tried to unclench his hands from the turret rim, but his fingers were locked in a spasm. He looked down at his crew. Jackson was slumped over the steering levers, breathing in ragged gasps. Kowalski was staring blankly at the empty shell casing on the floor. "We check," Miller said, his voice sounding hollow and distant to his own ears. "We verify." He climbed out of the turret, his boots sliding on the flour-covered deck. His legs felt like jelly as he hit the cobblestones. He walked toward the rear of the 5th Tiger. Up close, the machine was terrifyingly large, a steel fortress that towered over him. He ran his gloved hand over the jagged hole where his last shell had entered. It was a small, unassuming puncture wound for such a massive beast, but it had been enough to kill the heart of the dragon. He walked back up the street, retracing their path of destruction. It was a graveyard of giants. The 4th Tiger in the alleyway was still burning, the heat intense enough to melt the snow on the rooftops. The 3rd Tiger, the one with the broken transmission, sat silent in the middle of the road, like a beached whale. Further back, near the cemetery and the drainage ditch, the smoke from the first 2 kills rose into the gray sky like funeral pyres. 5 Tigers, the pride of the Wehrmacht, the invincible steel fist that was supposed to punch a hole through to Antwerp, all destroyed by a vehicle that the Ordnance Department had classified as lightly armored. A jeep skidded around the corner, its tires fighting for traction on the ice. It was Captain Reynolds from Company HQ, followed by a squad of infantrymen. They stopped dead, staring at the carnage. Reynolds jumped out, looking from the burning Tigers to the flower-covered, debris-strewn Hellcat sitting in the courtyard. "Miller?" Reynolds shouted, disbelief written all over his face. "Did you call in air support? Who killed these?" Miller leaned against the fender of his toy, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "We did, sir. Just us." The infantrymen walked past the Tigers with wide eyes. They touched the cold steel, as if to make sure they were real. These were the men who had called the M18 a suicide box. Now, they looked at Miller's crew with something approaching reverence. The mockery was gone. In 1 hour, Miller had not only stopped a breakthrough, he had shattered the myth of the Tiger's invincibility in this sector. But the war didn't stop for a victory lap. The radio in the jeep crackled to life. It was the battalion commander. The German assault wasn't just here, it was everywhere. The 12th SS Panzer Division was hitting the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath with everything they had. The line was buckling. "Miller, what's your status?" Reynolds asked, looking at the battered Hellcat. "We have 2 rounds of high explosive left, sir. No armor piercing. The turret traverse is grinding, and I think we cracked a road wheel when we went through the bakery. Can it move?" "It can move. Refuel and rearm at the depot behind the church. Then get to the ridge line east of Krinkelt. B Company is losing their Shermans. They need help." Miller nodded. He climbed back onto the deck of the Hellcat. The adrenaline crash was over, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They weren't fighting for medals. They weren't fighting to prove a point anymore. They were fighting to survive. "Load up," Miller told his crew. "We're not done yet." As the Hellcat roared to life, coughing a cloud of blue smoke, Miller looked back one last time at the graveyard of Tigers. The toy was going back to war, but now the Germans knew what it could do, and that made the next fight infinitely more dangerous. The resupply depot behind the church wasn't a depot anymore. It was a muddy crater filled with desperate men. Logistics trucks were burning, and medics were using ammo crates as operating tables. When Miller pulled the Hellcat in, the supply sergeant just pointed at a pile of loose shells on the ground. "Take what you can carry," he yelled over the sound of incoming mortars. "We're pulling out in 10 minutes. Kowalski and Davis scrambled off the deck, grabbing shells like starving men grabbing bread. They managed to secure 12 rounds of high explosive and miraculously 2 more HVAP rounds found in a discarded crate. It wasn't enough for a war, but it was enough for the next hour. "Fuel?" Jackson asked, looking at the gauge. They were running on fumes. "Take it from the deuce and a half," Miller ordered, gesturing to an abandoned truck. They siphoned 10 gallons of gasoline using a rubber hose and a helmet. It was crude, it was dangerous, and it was the only reason they didn't become a stationary pillbox. At 14 hours, they moved out toward the ridgeline east of Krinkelt. The geography of the battle had changed. The fog had lifted, replaced by a low, oppressive gray sky that promised more snow. As they crested the hill, Miller saw the scale of the German offensive for the first time. It wasn't just a column of tigers anymore. The entire horizon was moving. Field gray uniforms, half-tracks, assault guns, a tidal wave of steel and flesh rolling toward the twin villages. The toy and its crew dug in on the reverse slope of the ridge, hull down behind a frozen hedgerow. To their left was a Sherman Firefly from the British sector, its long 17-pounder barrel pointing menacingly at the valley. To their right, a platoon of American infantry was frantically chipping foxholes into the permafrost. "Red," Davis whispered, using Miller's nickname for the first time since Normandy. "Look at them. There's thousands of them." "Targets are targets," Miller said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "We stay low. We let the big boys start the party. We're flank security." But the Germans didn't wait for the party to start. They brought the party with them. At 16:30, as dusk began to turn the snow purple, the German artillery opened up. This wasn't the precision fire of the morning. This was a barrage designed to erase a grid square. Nebelwerfer rockets, the dreaded screaming Mimes, howled through the air, their terrifying shriek breaking the morale of men who had stood firm against tanks. The ground around the Hellcat erupted. Clods of frozen earth, the size of engine blocks, rained down on the open turret. Miller pulled the canvas cover over the top, a pathetic shield against shrapnel, and huddled with his crew on the floor of the fighting compartment. The metal hull rang like a bell with every near miss. "They're softening us up," Jackson yelled. "They're coming." When the barrage lifted, a strange, eerie light flooded the battlefield. The Germans were bouncing searchlights off the clouds to create artificial moonlight. It turned the night into a ghostly, high-contrast nightmare. Shadows stretched long and distorted. Through this spectral light, the Volksgrenadiers attacked. They didn't come with tanks this time. They came as human waves, rushing up the slope with MP-40s and Panzerfausts. This was the M18's weakness. It had no bow machine gun. It relied on the 50 caliber ring mounted on the turret, which required Miller to stand up and expose himself to fire. "Infantry! 2 o'clock! Close range!" Miller threw off the canvas and grabbed the handles of the Ma-Deuce. He unleashed a stream of 50 caliber tracers into the darkness. The heavy rounds tore through the snow and the attackers, but for every man that fell, 2 more seemed to emerge from the shadows. "High explosive, fuse delay, put it into the ground in front of them," Miller ordered Davis. The 76mm gun roared, firing HE shells into the earth just 50 yards ahead of their position. The explosions sent deadly splinters of ice and rock tearing through the German lines. It was brutal, close-quarters butchery. The elegant sniper duels of the morning were gone. This was a street fight with heavy weapons. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos. A high-pitched whistle, followed by a thwump. A flare illuminated the sky directly above them. "They're marking us," Miller realized with horror. A second later, the Sherman Firefly to their left exploded. A Panzerfaust team had crept up through the hedgerow. The British tank burned with a ferocity that lit up the entire ridge. Miller saw the German soldiers silhouetted against the flames, reloading their launchers. They were turning toward the Hellcat. "Jackson! Pivot right! Run them over!" Miller screamed. He couldn't depress the main gun low enough to hit them. The toy had to become a battering ram. The Hellcat spun on a dime, its 18 tons of steel pirouetting on the frozen mud. The engine screamed as Jackson floored the accelerator, driving the right track forward while locking the left. The M18 didn't just turn, it lashed out like a cornered beast. The rear of the tank swung violently into the hedgerow where the German Panzerfaust team was crouching. There was no gunfire, just the sickening sound of wood snapping and the dull, heavy thud of metal impacting flesh. The Hellcat crushed the hedgerow flat, burying the threats beneath its tracks. It was brutal, primal warfare. The elegance of the long-range duel was gone. This was murder at zero range. "Clear!" Right side clear, Kowalski yelled, his voice cracking. He was clutching the grip of a submachine gun, ready to spray anything that moved near the open turret. But they weren't safe. A second-shaped charge whizzed past Miller's head, trailing sparks, and detonated against a tree 10 yards away. The shockwave slapped them hard. The ridgeline was falling. To their right, the American infantry platoon was being overrun. Men were fighting hand-to-hand in the foxholes with entrenching tools and bayonets. "Fall back," the radio crackled. "All units, fall back to the church. Line is broken. Jackson, get us out of here. Reverse slope. Go," Miller commanded. The Hellcat lurched backward, sliding down the icy hill away from the oncoming human wave. They were leaving the high ground, retreating into the inferno of the villages below. As they descended, Miller looked back. The ridge was swarming with gray figures. The Germans had taken the position. Now, they would bring their heavy armor up to fire down into the town. Miller checked his watch. 17:15. Darkness had fully descended, illuminated only by the artificial moonlight and the fires of burning vehicles. They were blind, battered, and running low on ammunition. They reached the outskirts of Krinkelt. The narrow streets were choked with retreating chaos. Jeeps, trucks, and wounded men on foot were clogging the arteries of the village. The military police were trying to direct traffic, but panic was setting in, and amidst it all, the Hellcat looked like a battered ghost. Its fenders were torn off, the hull was scarred by shrapnel, and the crew looked like millers dipped in flour and blood. "Sarge, the temp gauge is redlining," Jackson warned. "We pushed the engine too hard on the hill. Let it burn if you have to," Miller said. "Just get us to the church square. We need a choke point." Miller knew that once the Germans secured the ridge, the Panthers and Tigers would roll down the main road. The church square was the only place where the roads converged. If they could hold that intersection, they bought time for the rest of the division to establish a secondary line. As they pulled into the square, the scene was apocalyptic. The church steeple had been blown off, and the rubble was piled high against the stone walls. An American Sherman tank sat burning in the center, its crew dead inside. Miller directed the Hellcat into the shadows of a ruined hotel facing the main approach. "Shut down," Miller ordered. "Let the engine cool." We listen. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. They sat in the dark, shivering as the adrenaline faded. Miller passed around his canteen. It was frozen slush, but it washed the taste of cordite from their mouths. "We have 2 rounds of HE left," Davis said quietly, "and the 50 calories is down to half a belt. What are we doing here, Red?" "We're a speed bump," Miller admitted. "A very annoying, very dangerous speed bump." At 17:45, the sound returned. Clanking, squeaking, heavy engines idling. The Germans were probing the perimeter. A single spotlight swept across the ruins, its beam cutting through the smoke. It lingered on the burning Sherman, then moved toward the hotel. Miller ducked below the armor ring. "Stay down. Let them commit." A German half-track, an SD, KFZ, 251, rolled cautiously into the square. It was packed with infantry. Behind it, the long barrel of a Panther tank emerged from the darkness. The Panther was a deadly adversary faster than a Tiger, with better sloped armor, and Miller had no armor-piercing shells left. "Sarge," Davis whispered urgently, "we can't scratch that Panther with high explosive." "I know," Miller whispered back, his eyes locked on the half-track. "We're not shooting the tank." Miller's plan was cruel but necessary. If he fired at the Panther, the shell would bounce, and the Panther would kill them. But the half-track was soft, and it was blocking the Panther's path. "Target the half-track. Center mass. Wait for my mark." The German column inched forward. The soldiers in the half-track were scanning the windows of the buildings, looking for snipers. They didn't look into the shadows of the hotel lobby, where the M18 was hiding. Now, the 76mm gun barked. The HE shell hit the half-track from 50 yards away. The vehicle didn't just explode, it disintegrated. The blast wave killed everyone inside instantly and turned the wreckage into a flaming barricade. The Panther tank behind it slammed on its brakes, its path blocked by the burning carcass of its support vehicle. "Machine gun! Suppress the infantry!" Miller grabbed the .50 caliber. He opened fire on the German troops trying to bail out of the chaos. The square lit up with tracers. The Panther couldn't move forward. It began to reverse, its turret swinging wildly, searching for the muzzle flash. But Miller was already moving. Back out the rear, shoot and scoot. Jackson reversed the Hellcat through the back wall of the hotel, crushing furniture and debris, disappearing into the night just as the Panther's 75mm shell demolished the front of the building. They had stalled the advance. But they had also announced their position to every German gunner in the sector. They were now alone in the maze of the twin villages, with one shell left and an entire panzer division hunting them. The next 3 hours were not a battle. They were a blur of chaotic survival. Miller navigated the Hellcat through a labyrinth of burning timber and collapsing masonry. The twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath had become a slaughterhouse. German infantry swarmed every alley, and King Tiger tanks, the big brothers of the ones Miller had killed, were now pushing into the main squares, crushing jeeps and men alike under their massive tracks. "Gauge is empty, Sarge," Jackson said, his voice flat. "The engine is sputtering. We have maybe a mile left." "Keep moving until the tracks stop turning," Miller replied. He was standing on the commander's seat, gripping the .50 caliber machine gun, scanning the rooftops for Panzerfaust teams. They were ghosts in a burning graveyard. Twice, they passed within 50 feet of German armor in the darkness. The only reason they weren't spotted was the Hellcat's low profile and the thick, choking smoke that blanketed the town. They were no longer hunting. They were running the gauntlet to reach the defensive perimeter the 2nd Infantry Division was desperately trying to establish to the west. At 21, they hit a roadblock. A mound of rubble and destroyed vehicles blocked the street. Figures were moving in the shadows. "Identify," a voice shouted in English. "Identify or we fire." Flash. Miller screamed the challenge code. "Thunder," came the reply. It was a platoon from the 38th Infantry Regiment. They pulled the razor wire aside, and the battered Hellcat limped through, its engine coughing and dying just as it cleared the perimeter. They had made it. They were inside the iron triangle. Miller dropped down into the turret. His legs finally gave out, and he slid to the floor, sitting amidst the spent shell casings. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 12 hours vanished, leaving a crushing exhaustion. He looked at his crew. They were covered in soot, flour, oil, and dried blood. They looked like coal miners who had dug their way out of hell. "We made it," Kowalski whispered, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. "I can't believe we made it." A lieutenant from the infantry platoon climbed onto the deck. He looked at the scarred armor of the M18, at the missing fenders, the tree branches still tangled in the camouflage net. "You boys look like you've been through the grinder," he said. "We heard heavy fighting on the East Ridge. Was that you?" "That was us," Miller said softly. "What did you run into?" Miller looked at the lieutenant. How could he explain? How could he describe the duel in the mist, the smell of burning tigers, the sound of tracks snapping? "We ran into the 1st SS Panzer Division," Miller said. "We slowed them down." The lieutenant nodded, clearly not grasping the magnitude of the statement. "Well, get some rest. We're holding here for the night. You're out of the fight." But they weren't out of the fight. Not really. All night long, the sound of battle raged around them. The Germans threw wave after wave against the twin villages, trying to break the American line. But the line held. It held because of thousands of small acts of desperate courage. It held because a handful of men in toy tanks had blunted the spearhead when it mattered most. Miller didn't sleep. He sat on the engine deck of his cold tank, watching the fires burn in the distance. He thought about the 5 Tigers. He thought about the arrogance of the German commanders who had dismissed his vehicle. And he thought about the men who had died to buy this time. Morning came slowly on December 19th. The gray light revealed the true cost of the battle. The fields around the villages were littered with burning hulks. But the German advance had stalled. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, but the critical breakthrough at Rocherath had failed. At 8, a jeep pulled up. It was Colonel Higgins, the battalion commander. He walked straight to Miller's tank. He didn't say a word at first. He just walked around the vehicle, inspecting the damage, counting the hit marks from shrapnel and machine gun fire. Then he looked at Miller. "I read the after-action report from Captain Reynolds," the colonel said. "He confirmed 5 Tiger kills." 5. "Is that accurate, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." Miller stood at attention. Confirmed by the infantry. The colonel shook his head, a look of disbelief and pride on his face. They told me these M18s were too light to fight in the line. They told me we should keep them in reserve. You just rewrote the manual, son. It's not the tank, sir, Miller said, looking at his sleeping crew. It's the men inside. The colonel handed Miller a fresh pack of cigarettes. Get your crew fed. Mechanics are coming up with a fuel truck and ammo. We're moving out at noon. Moving out where, sir? Elsenborn Ridge, the colonel said, pointing to the high ground in the west. We're going to dig in and make sure they never get past this forest. And Miller? Sir? Paint a ring on that barrel for every tiger you killed. I want the Germans to know exactly who they're messing with. By noon on December 19th, a bucket of white paint was found in the ruins of a farmhouse. Sergeant Thomas Red Miller stood on the muddy deck of his M18 Hellcat, a brush in his hand. Carefully, methodically, he painted 5 thick white rings around the blackened barrel of the 76mm gun. 5 rings. Each one represented a Tiger tank, 60 tons of German steel, that had been stopped by 18 tons of American grit. The infantrymen passing by stopped to watch. They didn't say a word. They just nodded. The white rings were more than a kill count. They were a symbol that the monsters could be killed. The Hellcat, battered and scarred, with its fenders missing and its engine coughing blue smoke, looked like a prize fighter who had gone 15 rounds and refused to fall. The 99th Infantry Division held Elsenborn Ridge. The German offensive in the north, the critical shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge, was stopped cold. Historians would later call it the Little Verdun. They would write about the artillery, the weather, and the grand strategy. But for the men on the ground, the victory belonged to the small, desperate actions of individual crews who refused to retreat. Miller and his crew fought on. They pushed into Germany in 1945. They crossed the Rhine. They saw the end of the 1,000-year Reich. The M18 Hellcat, the vehicle that was mocked as a toy and a suicide box, ended the war with the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle. It wasn't the armor that made it deadly. It was the speed, and more importantly, it was the men inside. Thomas Miller survived the war. He returned to Ohio in 1946, married his high school sweetheart, and opened a hardware store. He rarely spoke about Rocherath. He never bragged about the 5 tigers. Like many of his generation, he locked the memories away in a box, buried deep beneath the routine of peace. But every winter, when the snow fell heavy and the temperature dropped below 0, Miller would sit on his porch and stare at the white fields. He could still smell the cordite, he could still hear the growl of the Maybach engines, and he could still feel the vibration of the toy underneath his boots. He died in 1998. At his funeral, an old man approached the coffin. It was Kowalski, the loader. He placed a single photo on the casket. It was a grainy black-and-white picture taken in a muddy field in Belgium. 4 young men, covered in soot, standing in front of a tank with 5 white rings painted on the barrel. The story of Sergeant Miller teaches us a profound lesson about warfare and life. We often judge strength by size, by weight, by the thickness of armor. We look at the Tiger tank and we see power. We look at the Hellcat and we see vulnerability. But in the chaos of reality, agility often beats brute force. Intelligence beats arrogance. And a toy in the hands of a master is more dangerous than a fortress in the hands of a fool. They mocked his tank. They laughed at his chances. Until the smoke cleared, and the only thing left standing on the burning streets of Rocherath was the underdog. If this story of courage and tactical brilliance moved you, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten chapters of history with the world. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story from the front lines. And tell me in the comments, do you think speed is better than armor? Would you rather be in a Tiger or a Hellcat? Let the debate begin. I'll see you in the next war story.